Welcome to Bird Burger, where we talk about all things wildlife and nature oriented. Wildlife photography is an art that's centered around admiring the intricacies and beauty of nature. Yet, when we're out doing wildlife photography, to varying degrees, we wind up affecting the environment around us. Is the pure act of wildlife photography too damaging in and of itself? And if not, what's the line? So today, I'm really excited to be joined by Alecia Smith here on the podcast, who's a chair member of the Ventura Audubon Society, an advocate for protecting birds, has some really good thoughts to share, I think, today. So, Alecia, how are you doing?
Doing great. How are you, Jeremy?
Great. Thanks for coming on today and just being willing to share some of your perspectives on this. I've loved getting to talk with you a little bit in the past about some of the thoughts you've had. We got to talk a little bit over the phone in prep for this podcast, and I really thought you had a lot of really good, valuable stuff to say. So I'm excited to have you here today.
Thanks so much for having me. Definitely a passion of mine, and I'm happy to be here.
So you have some really cool stuff. So I know we're not talking about wildlife photography in the sense of like the art or the talent too much today, but I just would like to really quick highlight that you have some really cool stuff, specifically working with kind of light and color. I like the way you work with light and color. So it's really cool to get to see kind of your wildlife photography. And I think you have some really good content for anyone out there watching just to go and follow. So I really love that. But the purpose of today's episode is to talk about wildlife photography ethics, right? This is kind of a deep and kind of touchy subject, right? That we kind of get to go through. And so you have the boldness of kind of stepping out and talking about it today with me. So thank you for that. To start out, can you tell us a little bit just about like who you are and what you do for your work with the Ventura Audubon Society?
Yeah. At Ventura Audubon, I work as our volunteer and outreach coordinator. So some of the things I do involve our monitoring work, which would be like helping monitor western snowy plovers and California least terns, habitat protection. But the biggest thing that I do is work with our volunteers. We refer to them as beach naturalists. They go through a classroom training, they go through a field training, and it's really to help raise awareness for the species that we focus on. But it isn't just about those two birds. It's really about the whole beach ecosystem and all of the wildlife that inhabit it. So it's really like the most important thing for our team is during nesting season is really to get the message out there and to help folks understand how our presence does have an impact, whether we know it or not. And a lot of my most recent efforts have been around trying to really lower our assumptions, because when you've spent a lot of time focusing on these birds and you watch them have their chicks on the beach and you witness a lot of disturbance, it can feel like nobody cares, like that you're meeting someone who doesn't care that they're hurting those birds. But for me, it's been helpful to really kind of take a step back and remember where I started and to really help just be more curious and ask questions to people that I interact with in the public and to try to understand where they're at on, their sort of journey with nature and figure out how I can help the birds at the same time.
Wow, that's some deep stuff already. Question number one. Yeah, I love that. I mean, it's such a different approach talking to people who are not, I guess, like, I don't know what the right word would be, but maybe nature oriented or wildlife oriented. It's such a different approach. And I think that that's really interesting how you kind of put that distinguishment there. And I want to talk about that in a bit specifically, because I think that's a really good conversation to have. To start out, just, I guess, with wildlife photography and just to ask you, I kind of have two kind of more general questions to start out with. When we as wildlife photographers are out in the field, how can we kind of just best ethically approach nature, and what are some boundaries that maybe we should have in place, in your opinion?
So for me, I think just in general, the way I try to think about wildlife photography is I try to be as empathetic as I can. And I guess what I mean by that is I know that I can't know exactly how a bird feels. I'm going to say bird because that's my focus.
Yeah.
I can't know exactly how that bird feels, but I do have my own experiences that I can recall. For instance, I'm a woman, and so I do a lot of wildlife photography by myself, and I don't always feel safe, and I haven't always been safe. So I can know how it feels if someone is being too intrusive or if someone is making me feel really uncomfortable. So I think for me, when it comes to wildlife photography, there are times when you think you have these certain rules that you've mastered and that you don't have to think about it anymore. But for me, I try to remember that it isn't so much about those rules that I've set for myself. It's more about being aware of the bird's behavior and how I might be impacting that. So for instance, like I focus a lot on shorebirds. So with a shorebird, just because that bird didn't fly away from me, that doesn't mean I'm not disturbing it. So I try to really pay attention to their behavior. If they've stopped feeding, if they've stopped preening, if they've, frozen in place, and I can see that they are trying to hide or something like that, then that's kind of my cue to back away and give that bird more space. Where I think with a lot of people, their interpretation might be that, oh, well, I didn't make that bird fly away, so I'm not disturbing it. But I think it's a little deeper than that. So that's why I say empathy is the best thing for me, because I try to remember how I might feel and try not to pressure that bird too much. Hopefully I'm not getting too off track, but on the topic of ethics, there are certainly things for me that are, just not acceptable. I think like one thing would just be like that example that comes to mind for me would be owl baiting, like trying to give an animal food just to get a photograph. And so I would say that I like to think about it in terms of just having an empathetic approach, but there are certain things that I witness within the photography community where, that's something where I'm not okay with it personally. And yeah, I just wanted to share that.
No, that's some great stuff. Even kind of like referring to what we were talking about a second ago, though, like there can even be differences of someone who's like completely unaware, like an average public human, right? Versus a wildlife photographer who kind of should know maybe a lot more about this culture, this community, or the effects of this. So that's definitely a deep dive too. But I love what you shared. And regarding like how you were talking about, the common conception is flushing means that you've disturbed it. That's a really good point that you bring up, because I mean, even you were talking about shorebirds. Like, I mean, I think of a telltale sign as them being like running away from you. If you're constantly making them run the other direction, you're photographing their butt 24/7.
Yeah.
Then that means you're most likely in that process of disturbing it, right? Of course, it's going to do, it's going to take its freeform pattern. But if it's just constantly going away from you, that's you pushing it, right? So
yeah,
that's a great example. When it comes to nesting season, do you think that there's maybe some extra precautions that should be put in place?
Yeah, so I think with nesting season, probably something, I mean, the biggest thing to keep in mind is just space. And I think anyone who's used to shorebird world, they hear, they hear the term like share the shore or make space for shorebirds and things like that. And so I think that just like being aware of the birds that are around you. And also when it comes to nesting, if you're visiting a site that is known to have nesting behavior or actual chicks that are going to be on the beach, I think it's really important to just not, go for a jog or to forget that something really sensitive is happening. And I think with snowy plovers in particular, that's important to me, because for me, like with all of my experience of being able to see those chicks in person, even like as a person who pours all these hours into watching them, they can sneak up on me sometimes, and they really are camouflaged. So at times, they are crushed to death by people that don't know that they're there. And so I think it's just remembering to give them space, but also to just be extra observant, like hyper aware of what's happening, especially I feel if it's not just for photographers, but if you are a photographer and you have that awareness, I think in a sense you have kind of an extra responsibility to be cautious. And I think kind of like what I was mentioning earlier, just because the bird maybe didn't fly away or run away, still be aware of how much time you're spending with them, because at a beach, especially in the summer, like that's a super popular time for lots of people to be there. So if you're that extra person and you happen to be the only one that knows that they're there, but you're crowding them and that's the only safe spot they have to rest and to refuel, I think that's where, you just don't want to pour too much time into photographing their chicks, and just make sure you give them that extra space. And definitely like when it comes to either like roped off areas or fenced off areas, I think curiosity can get the best of us at times, but it is important to respect those areas because a lot of times there may be a nest that you don't know and your eye isn't even trained to see, and you could easily trample that. If you don't trample it, then the adult could perceive it as disturbance and they could abandon the nest altogether. So I think it's just, remembering that those kind of like signs and educational information are out there to help protect them. And it isn't just, a group of people trying to be bossy or something like that. It is there for a reason.
Yeah, those are some good points you bring up. I'd really love to, so I'd love to ask you this question. You mentioned like rules earlier, right? And you were talking about, rules aren't always necessarily the best judge of disturbance. And not to say that we should be in this place of lawlessness where there are no rules. It just does bring up a lot of, I think, good conversation. So there's a video that I released earlier this week that actually at the time of us talking about this hasn't been up yet. But in that video, I talk about a situation in which the rules did not necessarily match the scenario going on, and I had someone that went a little bit over the top at me for not adhering to a rule that I accidentally broke. I wasn't even aware of, but in that situation, wound up causing a scene and causing more damage to the wildlife in that scenario because they were mad that I was breaking a rule that I wasn't aware of, and then it wound up causing a little bit more damage. So I think rules is a really, really interesting conversation because rules can go so far one way or another. Like they're there to protect and to do good things, but then sometimes they're not able to, how would I say this, like adapt to the scenario correctly, but then they can also cause a little bit more conflict or strife in some scenarios. A really interesting thing that we were talking about earlier was you were talking about how the Ventura Audubon Society was trying to think of slogans for this upcoming nesting season, right? And you were talking about 100 feet of space, and you guys were thinking of coming up with a slogan that's like, give shorebirds 100 feet of space. And you were mentioning that one of your team members kind of had this scenario or was thinking in their brain, well, realistically, I don't know if I can keep that rule. Like realistically, I don't know if I can keep that rule of 100 feet of space, or I don't know, I guess if I'm willing to, because, that means I'd be staying off every beach that I'm on, so on and so forth. So you had some really interesting thoughts on that. I'd love for you to share, specifically kind of even taking a step into the idea of ethical goals versus ethical reality and what's that balance there. I know that was a really long statement and question, but I'd love for you to kind of maybe elaborate a little bit more on that slogan, maybe the story of that, the progression since our last conversation.
Yeah, totally. So just for context, when it comes to that slogan, that was in reference to a new outreach program we have, and it's targeted specifically at a beach. It's called Hollywood Beach, and this location is quite different than our other main project site. So this location has like actual houses that are on the sand. So for the people that live there, they open their back door, and to them, their backyard is the beach. And in a lot of cases, that means there's a snowy plover nest in their backyard, essentially. And so a lot of folks have this idea that because that's my backyard, I'm going to open up the door and my dog's going to run outside and exercise by itself, and then it's going to come back whenever it feels like coming back, and that sort of thing. So a totally different world for what my experience was, which is like being at a much bigger beach that doesn't have houses, that's less urbanized. And so to try to have an outreach conversation with someone where you're basically asking them to alter their behavior in their own home, it's quite different than someone who's just visiting the beach for the day. So we have a new outreach program, and it's not totally unique. It's done in other locations, but we're calling it Dog Rangers. And basically, instead of like walking up to a homeowner or whoever is at that beach and saying, hey, your dog shouldn't be here, or your dog should be on a leash. It's a reframing, and it's asking if the dog would be willing to do these 4 things. And one of those 4 things is the 100 feet of space that I mentioned. And the team member you spoke of is someone, who does nest monitoring. So it's literally not possible to always give birds 100 feet of space. And it's also not possible for most beachgoers either. But I think the way I think of rules, in terms of like what I would be asking for someone to do with their dog, or what I would be asking myself to do, is it's like, you're not always going to be perfect. You're not always going to fall into whatever these rules say. It's not black or white to me. It's simply not possible if you're going to exist in this world. And so, but I don't think that should stop us from striving, like making that the goal. The goal is that I'm empathizing with this bird, and I know it's stressed out because there are hundreds of people here today and there are dogs running around and it's trying to protect its chick. And so in that way, I think the rule is just there to remind myself and to remind others what the goal should be, knowing that might not be completely realistic. So it isn't like, hey, you learned the rule and now when you break it, I get to like wag my finger at you. That's not how I think about it. And so that's what I reminded my teammate of, is it's like, I'm not saying this is a hard rule. It's just, it's one of the goals that we would want folks to have, especially folks that are walking their dog at the beach. And that's just for anyone who doesn't have that understanding. It's just that even if someone has a dog that doesn't chase birds, the bird still understands it as a predator. It thinks of it as like a coyote or something that might be looking for eggs or chicks to eat.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. I love what you're sharing there. It's not about the black and whiteness of it, but it's about the goal and the striving for it. And I think that, man, our world, I think, makes a lot of good steps forward when we think of, I mean, going beyond wildlife photography ethics, when we think of a lot of matters that way, right? It's not like it's something where it's like, overnight, everyone's going to, just be perfect, law-abiding citizens that are going to be able to do everything perfectly, but rather if we're taking small steps in the right direction, that's going to result in big strides as we progress further and further. So I really like that. And I know for me, I think that I've taken, I feel like, more and more small steps as I move forward in my career when I'm out doing wildlife photography, to do things that are caring for the wildlife that I'm with, but also even in my personal life, right? Like, you can apply that so much wider in the ways that we care for nature in terms of environmentally, by the things that we purchase, the things that we eat, and all those things. And it's very difficult for someone to change overnight, like just into a hard, fast rule, like you said, like that 100 feet of space rule. If everyone was to try to do that overnight, it wouldn't work. It just simply wouldn't. But if we can all strive in our consciousness to just give them a little bit more room, and each day gets a little bit more peaceful for that bird, I think that's an awesome goal. So I really like you sharing that. So when it comes to the common population and how we, as, I don't know, for lack of a better word, guardians of nature, interact with them, it becomes, you've already been talking about it, but it becomes a very interesting and different story. You were talking about that scenario of people, their backyards, but then you were also talking about beach goers. There's two different categories of people. I know you've talked about it a little bit, but I'd love to hear a little bit more, maybe even, I guess, more tangibly, or any other examples of how you guys at the Ventura Audubon Society kind of approach that conversation with people who have really sometimes no awareness of their effect on nature.
So I think in the past, and this is reflective for the way that I've approached it in the past and others that I know, it would be, I think, especially during nesting season, it can really feel like an emergency, and it can feel like I just have to tell this person this information right this second and get them to stop, let's say causing harm if it's like a dog that's running off leash or something like that. And so what I found is that when you only focus on what that person, let's say, is doing wrong, and I'm not saying like it's my place to call it right or wrong, but if you're in the mindset of, I just have to inform you of this bad thing that you're doing, what I've learned is I think people mostly shut off, and they don't want to hear what you have to say. And they're certainly not inspired to protect this bird that you care a whole lot about, because the first thing you've said to them is like, hey, you're hurting this thing that I love and you've got to get out of here. Like, that's all they can hear. And so, so for me, I think like my sort of revised approach is really trying to remember that the conversation should be framed around like asking questions and being curious. So, hey, my name's Alecia. How are you doing today? And try to pull like, what is it that got them to the beach today? Are they there for a picnic, or do they actually already like birds, or is that why they're taking a walk? And then I try to ask, have you heard of the Western snowy plover? and see how they respond. And sometimes they already have awareness, but a lot of times, like even the homeowners that I was speaking of, I've met grandparents and grandchildren that live in those houses that didn't even know what a Western snowy plover was. So that can be a special moment if you start with curiosity and you ask if they even know what it is. And then the unique thing about that beach is you have that opportunity to point the birds out to them and to even point out the chicks to them in some cases. And so to me, that's more inspiring, is just trying to get them to see the bird rather than just automatically jumping to what is it that they're doing that is wrong. And once you recognize whether or not they knew that bird existed, and once you kind of see where they are, then that's where you can say, hey, if you want to help birds, if your dog would like to help birds, in fact, here are some things that you can consider. And so I think for me, I've realized that that's just, I don't know, it's just a more open way of trying to have a conversation. And it allows me not to walk into it with a judgment that this person just doesn't care. Because even if I see what their behavior is and I perceive it as being harmful, I can't know like where they're at on their own personal journey or what amount of awareness they have. And I know I'm saying the word awareness a lot, but I think something I've thought of a lot recently too is that it isn't just awareness, like that isn't going to solve it. I think we need more connection to nature, because that's where you get inspired to protect it. And so I don't know if that makes sense, but that's kind of the approach that I'm trying to take.
Yeah, that completely makes sense. I mean, even personally, I know that, I mean, I can't think of a single time in my life where I've been inspired to change because someone's gotten upset at me and yelled at me up front and told me like what I'm doing is wrong. I can't think of I mean, even as open of a person as I try to be, that's probably maybe never happened to me in my life, maybe except with my wife, but
Yeah.
but beyond that, like there's no one else that I'm going to let treat me in that way. Like, I don't think that's the right way to treat a human. Just like in the way that we wouldn't, I don't know, treat nature with a poor attitude, or that's our hope, right? Is we don't want to treat humanity with that kind of poor attitude in the same manner. So I love what you were sharing on that. I think also you talked about it, their journey, right? What step in their journey are they on? That was one of the things I really loved in my podcast with Matt Gold that I had 4 months ago. Was he talked about this idea and this concept of the capacity to care, and he talked about it as something that it's not that people don't care, just like what you said. It's just that they're just at a different place, and everyone, maybe not everyone, but most people have a very similar capacity to care. They have, like if you were to look at a scale, or I don't know, whatever you'd call that, scale, yeah, I guess. Of 0 to 100, and 100 being, the ultimate protector of nature, or whatever you want to call that. Maybe many people wind up being on that, 10 to 30 range or something like that. But that's just because they don't have an intimacy with nature yet. They don't have a connection. They don't have a reason to care. They don't even have an awareness in a lot of situations. So I really like that concept that he brought up. With that concept in mind, you've already been kind of talking about it, but I think that there's definitely a change that should go on in the way that we approach people in our caring of nature, because we don't know what point of the journey they're on. I know you've already talked about that. Is there any other thoughts you kind of have regarding that capacity to care and how we should approach that?
Yeah, I think everything you said really, I think, summarizes my thoughts on it. And it's just, it's like, like if we can talk about, rules and regulations, and of course, all of those things are important. But in my own experience, even when there is a rule, let's say like a rule in place that says like, you can't have a dog here, oftentimes there aren't resources for enforcing that. And in addition to that, I have to wonder if someone wrote me a ticket, if I was walking my dog at the beach and I didn't know what a snowy plover was, I wonder if that would inspire me to want to save snowy plovers, for example. And so that's where I think it's like you said, I think like there's a lot of room for improvement in all of these conversations we have, whether it's about just a regular beachgoer who's recreating without a camera, or if it's a wildlife photographer who maybe has a goal of raising awareness for birds, for example, but just still has some things to learn where they could maybe be a little more delicate in their approach. And so I think when it comes to wildlife photography, something that, and this is just, I'm always trying to learn and be open, because I've certainly changed my own perspective over the last 4 years or so. But something I've noticed a lot recently when we talk about ethical wildlife photography, I feel like I can't get away from the fact that if we say ethical wildlife photography, it's like we're attempting to label it as something definite. Mm-hmm. And I think in some ways that can be harmful, because there's certain topics. It's not one I want to get into too deeply, but let's just say playback, for example. And with that topic, I think there is this drive to either label it as ethical or unethical, when in reality there is probably a gray area somewhere, at least for me. And I just wonder if that's where I feel like we just need more conversation and more dialogue, because I feel like at least in my own journey, once I figured out like you can look up an ethical guide to wildlife photography, and once you figure out what those rules are, then you feel like, okay, in order for me to do good in the world, I better tell everybody what these rules are, and I better try to enforce these rules. And I can say that when it comes to protecting snowy plovers as well. Once I learned those rules, it was like, okay, people just don't know these rules, so I have to tell them. And if I tell them, they're going to join my team and we're going to save these birds together. But I think the rules isn't the thing that's really inspiring. And also, a lot of times the labels, I think, can be a little bit polarizing, because it can feel like, oh, well, if at any point I did that, then I guess I'm unethical, and then maybe you don't want to take part in that conversation. And you just feel like you've been labeled, and someone wants to kind of put you over in this other corner or something. And then even if you have learned, that something you did disturbed a bird, it may be something that you're less willing to share because you don't want your community to shun you or something like that.
Wow.
So I'm probably getting a little off track, but yeah, those are just things I think about, like both in the work I do and just in wildlife photography in general.
Yeah, no, that's incredibly real. Thank you for sharing that. That's very deep. I mean, that is such like a thing nowadays, especially for, I'm gonna be honest, that relates to me a lot. Especially in the way of like, I'm not perfect. If I mess up, I often do get scared as I'm building my career on this and, hoping to go full time soon as a wildlife photographer. It scares me, the fact that people, for a mistake that I make, whether it's intentional or not, I could lose like my job overnight, my support for my wife and I. And that is scary. That's something that scares me a lot. And I also really like that you talk about grayscale, because man, we try to pin everything, like you said, we try to put a label on it. We try to make it, 100% always wrong, 100% always right. When in reality, really everything in life, there are those exceptions, right? And when we think about wildlife photography, I think that the mere act, I kind of, introduced that in my introduction, but the mere act of doing wildlife photography, if you are a wildlife photographer at some point in your career, you will wind up to a varying degree damaging kind of the natural order of things, if you want to put it that way. And it could be a very small degree. It could be the incrementaliest, smallest degree you've ever, imagined in your life, but it also could be a very large degree. And so it's important to recognize that all of us do have to take kind of responsibility for our own actions, and not just shun people out just because they're a little bit more guilty than us or a little bit less guilty than us, then, all that. And when I think about, even the polarization in our country, laws, if it was as simple as laws, like you were talking about, we would have a lot of things taken care of now, right? And obviously it's not. And what we find is that often the more we try to push and cram something down someone's throat who's not ready to talk about it or hasn't been approached about it well, I think we find them more often than not just digging a deeper trench where they want to be. And so if we're talking to someone, like you were saying, and labeling them as then unethical, then they're most likely, the way that the human brain works, that humanity works, is they're probably just going to just entrench themselves even deeper into this idea of like, you're wrong and I'm right, and it's just not going to work, right? So I think that's such so valuable what you brought up, and I really, really love that. So thank you very much for bringing that up. I want to ask you one more question, and I think this question was very interesting when I asked you it over the phone in prep for this podcast, and I'd love to hear you elaborate on it a little bit more and publicly too. I asked you the question, do people matter more than birds? Do birds matter more than people? Do you have any kind of thoughts regarding that?
I'll probably still be stuck in the same sort of mindset in response to that question. So, I mean, I definitely think all, human life and bird life is significant and important. What I will say is that when it comes to, birds facing extinction, certain species of birds and all of the disturbance that human activity plays a role in, I don't think that all of the fun that we have as humans is more important than the life of a bird. And so that's where I think there's like huge room for opportunity, especially when it comes to beach recreation, to shift the culture and to try to inspire more people to just be more connected to birds. I think that's where all of us have room to really think about what matters and what is important. So I can't choose one over the other, but I will say that if we know that something we're doing is harmful, and we don't all know that, but if we do, then I think that's where we have a responsibility to try to make a more positive impact for them, because and that goes for me too. I love shorebird photography, but if at some point, there was a place I like to visit that needed less visitors, and it needed for birds to have more space in order to survive, then that's something to where, okay, that activity that I enjoy, I need to cool it. I need to take a break, and that bird living is more important than me getting another shorebird photograph, for example. And that's how I think about it. And I don't know if that's the intention of your question, but that's kind of where my viewpoint is. Yeah, no,
however you wanted to take it. So I appreciate you sharing that. I think ultimately, just to kind of wrap it up too, I appreciate you coming on, sharing your thoughts. And I think that this is exactly what we need, right? It's more just conversation about it, open conversation, because that shows that we're caring and in progress as humans rather than just stagnant and sitting where we're at. And so I really think that open conversation, honest conversation where we're able to be real in a safe space like this is really good. So I just appreciate you being bold in that and just sharing your thoughts and all the valuable things you had to say. So
I did just want to add too, because I know I did my interpretation of myself, like learning all the rules and wanting to enforce them on others. But I also wanted to say that on the other end of the spectrum, I think sometimes when I'm part of these conversations with others, we're too quick to feel like there's not enough scientific data to back up what we would like to see in ethics. And for me, I think that's where that whole empathy approach comes from, because to me, even if I don't know for certain how that bird is feeling, I just want to remind anyone who's out there that for me, I do think that having a more empathetic approach is, I think it's better than feeling like, well, we don't have enough evidence, so let's just keep doing whatever we feel like doing and not think critically about our own behavior. So I just wanted to make sure I added that note as well.
Yep, are clear on that for sure. Yeah, no, thank you for sharing that. I think that's great. Yeah, you can't always, we aren't all knowing, right? We can't define everything logically, scientifically, and we never will be able to have a perfect understanding of nature or science. And so it's important sometimes, as cheesy as that sounds, to feel it out, to emotionally kind of connect with the scenario and understand empathetically, like you said, what's going on is huge. So I love that.
Well, thanks, Jeremy. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. And I'm definitely looking forward to just seeing all the good work you guys continue to do at Ventura Audubon Society. And the shots you continue to take, you have some great images, like I said. So I'm excited to see just your journey and how you continue. So
awesome. You too. Looking forward to seeing your work as well.
Thank you guys for watching. I hope that you found some value in this conversation that I was able to have today with Alecia Smith. If you haven't seen the other video that I released on Monday, make sure you go check that out, as it offers a little bit more of a perspective perspective on the wholeness of this conversation as well. We're trying to hit our goal of 1,000 subscribers before my birthday in a little bit less than a month now. So if you like this channel, find some value in it, make sure you go share it with a friend, share it with some others, and help me hit my goal of 1,000. And if so, I'll wind up going live on my birthday. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys around soon.